Imagine a man whose military uniform, impeccably buttoned and adorned with pristine insignias, concealed the reality of his being, a soul corroded by a blazing hatred. This hatred was not a fleeting resentment, but a latent fury, forged deep within his psyche, ready to erupt with unbridled violence. It was a seed sown in the darkness of his interior, nourished by real or perceived grievances, and whose blossoming would be a devastating carnage. Every fiber of his being was tense with this explosive emotion, waiting for the moment, the trigger that would transform calm into chaos, discipline into disorder. I invite you on a journey, not of pleasure, but of introspection and raw reality. This journey begins in the apparent innocence of a quiet home, a space that should have been a sanctuary, but became the prelude to tragedy. From that deceptive calm, I will drag you into the vortex of a massacre, where violence was unleashed mercilessly, leaving a trail of horror and destruction. We will continue through the labyrinthine corridors of justice, witnessing the trial, each testimony, each legal argument, a desperate attempt to understand the incomprehensible. Then, we will dive into the endless battles of appeals, where hope and despair intertwine in a macabre dance, prolonging the agony of waiting. We will pause in the final moments, those that precede the outcome, the last meal, a farewell ritual, or perhaps its absence, a void that speaks of hopelessness. And finally, we will witness his final words, a last echo of a life that is fading away, which may be a lament, a justification, or an eloquent silence. We will conclude this somber journey with a deep reflection, one that will force you to confront and question what the death penalty really represents in the complex and often contradictory landscape of the 21st century. Is it justice or barbarism? Deterrence or revenge? A vestige of the past or a solution for the future? Today we delve into a case that has shocked Florida and the country, an act of unimaginable domestic violence that culminates in the most definitive outcome: execution. We are talking about Edward J. Zakrzewski II, a name now etched in criminal history for the brutality of his crimes and the irreversibility of his punishment. On July 31st, 2025, the state of Florida will carry out the execution of Edward J. Zakrzewski II, a former airman of Eglin Air Force Base, for the horrific murders of his wife, Sylvia Zakrzewski, and his two small children, Edward, aged 7, and Anna, aged 5. These crimes, which occurred more than 3 decades ago, in 1994, still resonate with a chilling question. What drives a man to destroy his own family in the most barbaric way imaginable? Join us on this heartbreaking journey to understand not only the facts, but also the psyche behind such a monstrous crime, and the long road of justice until its culmination. The house was immersed in a sepulchral silence, a silence that, paradoxically, screamed the horror of what had already occurred. The crime had already spoken in its mute echoes. Before that fateful June 9th, 1994, the Zakrzewski family led an apparently quiet life in Mary Esther, a peaceful corner of Okaloosa County, Florida. At the heart of this family was Edward J. Zakrzewski II, a sergeant in the prestigious United States Air Force, who shared his home with Sylvia, his South Korean-born wife, and their 2 small children, Edward Jr. and Anna. To the outside world, to the neighbors and acquaintances watching from a distance, the Zakrzewskis might have seemed the very image of a normal military family, immersed in the routine of life on an airbase. However, as tragically often happens in the deepest family tragedies, beneath that surface of apparent normality and stability, a devastating storm was slowly brewing, accumulating unsustainable pressure. The cracks in Edward and Sylvia's marriage had, over time, become not only deep, but absolutely irreparable. Sylvia, with a courage that contrasted with the inner turmoil of her home, had made the difficult and momentous decision to seek a divorce. This step, which for her represented a search for peace and freedom, was for Edward apparently something completely unacceptable. For a man with a mindset that perhaps saw his family not only as an emotional core, but as an extension of himself or even as a tangible symbol of his status and control, Sylvia's request for a divorce must have been perceived not only as a challenge, but as the imminent collapse of his entire world. It was, without doubt, a direct affront to his authority, his pride, and the rigid conception he had of life and his place in it, triggering a reaction that few could have foreseen. What goes through a person's mind when their partner, the person with whom they have built a life and had children, decides to end that union? For most, it is a painful process of negotiation, of separation of assets and custody. But for Edward Zakrzewski, this request unleashed an uncontrollable fury, a primal rage that would lead him to an unthinkable act of violence. Not only did he refuse to accept the end of the relationship, but his distorted mind conceived a definitive way to solve the problem. According to the criminal profile, in cases of familicide, the murder of the family by one of its members, there is often an element of control and possession. The perpetrator sees his family not as individuals, but as property, and the threat of losing that control can trigger extreme violence. In Zakrzewski's case, Sylvia's request for a divorce was the trigger, the spark that ignited a powder keg of resentment and despair. The house was immersed in a sepulchral silence, a silence that, paradoxically, screamed the horror of what had already occurred. The crime had already spoken in its mute echoes. Before that fateful June 9, 1994, the Zakrzewski family led an apparently quiet life in Mary Esther, a peaceful corner of Okaloosa County, Florida. At the heart of this family was Edward J. Zakrzewski II, a sergeant in the prestigious United States Air Force who shared his home with Sylvia, his South Korean-born wife, and their two small children, Edward Jr. and Anna. To the outside world, to the neighbors and acquaintances watching from a distance, the Zakrzewskis might have seemed the very image of a normal military family, immersed in the routine of life on an airbase. However, as tragically often happens in the deepest family tragedies, beneath that surface of apparent normality and stability, a devastating storm was slowly brewing, accumulating unsustainable pressure. The cracks in Edward and Sylvia's marriage had, over time, become not only deep, but absolutely irreparable. Sylvia, with a courage that contrasted with the inner turmoil of her home, had made the difficult and momentous decision to seek a divorce. This step, which for her represented a search for peace and freedom, was, for Edward apparently, something completely unacceptable. For a man with a mindset that perhaps saw his family not only as an emotional core, but as an extension of himself or even as a tangible symbol of his status and control, Sylvia's request for a divorce must have been perceived not only as a challenge, but as the imminent collapse of his entire world. It was, without doubt, a direct affront to his authority, his pride, and the rigid conception he had of life and his place in it, triggering a reaction that few could have foreseen. What goes through a person's mind when their partner, the person with whom they have built a life and had children, decides to end that union? For most, it is a painful process of negotiation, of separation of assets and custody. But for Edward Zakrzewski, this request unleashed an uncontrollable fury, a primal rage that would lead him to an unthinkable act of violence. Not only did he refuse to accept the end of the relationship, but his distorted mind conceived a definitive way to solve the problem. According to the criminal profile, in cases of familicide, the murder of the family by one of its members, there is often an element of control and possession. The perpetrator sees his family not as individuals, but as property, and the threat of losing that control can trigger extreme violence. In Zakrzewski's case, Sylvia's request for a divorce was the trigger, the spark that ignited a powder keg of resentment and despair. According to a hypothetical forensic assessment, the accused showed no signs of impulsivity, but rather of methodical planning. On the night of June 9, 1994, the Zakrzewski house became the scene of unimaginable horror. Edward, driven by a rage and a sense of betrayal that stripped him of all humanity, perpetrated the crimes. First, he attacked his wife, Sylvia. The brutality of the attack was appalling. He struck her with a crowbar and a machete and then strangled her to death. This act, charged with personal and direct violence, speaks to a deep anger directed at the person he perceived as the source of his humiliation. The massacre, however, did not stop there. In an act of depravity that defies all human logic and understanding, Zakrzewski extended his brutality beyond his wife, turning against his own flesh and blood. His two small children, Edward Jr., only 7 years old, and little Anna, only 5, were killed with the same machete he had wielded against his wife. There was no mercy, no remorse in that dark moment. Imagine, If you dare, the pure and incomprehensible terror those children must have felt. The innocence that should have been their shield was brutally ripped from their souls. Visualize the confusion in their small eyes, the disbelief before the paternal figure who by nature should have been their protector, their refuge. Instead, he became their executioner, perpetrating the ultimate betrayal, the most abominable act imaginable. The annihilation of the very lives he had engendered and promised to care for. It is a horror etched into memory, a wound in the collective psyche that questions the very nature of evil. A hypothetical criminologist could analyze this pattern of violence. The murder of children in cases of familicide is often interpreted in several ways. As an extension of control, where the perpetrator believes he is freeing his children from a life without him or a life with the other parent, whom he hates, or as a way to take even deeper revenge on the partner who left him. The coldness of the murders, especially of the children, with a bladed weapon suggests an almost total emotional disconnection, a mind that had crossed a threshold of no return. The choice of weapons like a crowbar and a machete indicates visceral brutality, an intention to inflict maximum harm. After committing the crimes, Edward Zakrzewski did not stay to face the consequences. He fled. He disappeared, leaving behind the scene of his horrible crime and a stunned community. This flight is typical in many cases of this kind, as the perpetrator, often after the surge of adrenaline and rage, tries to evade capture, displaying a lack of immediate remorse and a survival instinct. The disappearance of Edward Zakrzewski and the crime scene left the Okaloosa County Police with a ghastly case. The investigation began immediately, but Zakrzewski had managed to evade initial capture. He is believed to have fled to Hawaii, attempting to vanish in the vast geography of the islands and begin a new life, far from justice. For about 4 months, Edward Zakrzewski was a fugitive. Authorities searched for him tirelessly, but without a clear lead, the investigation stalled. This is where the case took a crucial turn, one that highlights the power of the media in solving crimes. On October 14, 1994, the case of the Zakrzewski family murders was featured on the popular television show Unsolved Mysteries. This program, known for dramatizing unsolved crimes and asking for the public's help, became the key to capturing Zakrzewski. Imagine the tension the moment the episode aired, how millions of viewers tuned in, and suddenly the story of the Zakrzewskis unfolded before their eyes. For Edward, who likely thought he had escaped with impunity, seeing his own crime exposed on national television must have been an overwhelming shock. Less than 24 hours after the program aired, on October 15, 1994, Edward Zakrzewski turned himself in to the authorities. This act of surrender, after months on the run, suggests that the pressure of public exposure and the imminent certainty of being captured finally broke him. His subsequent confession would simplify the judicial process, although it would not diminish the enormity of his crimes. A forensic psychologist could argue that Zakrzewski's confession did not necessarily imply remorse, but perhaps an acceptance of reality, or even an underlying need for control, choosing the moment and manner of his surrender. For some perpetrators, being the center of attention, even for horrific crimes, can be a twisted way to gain recognition. Once captured, the legal process against Edward Zakrzewski moved quickly. Unlike many murder cases where the defense seeks acquittal or a lesser sentence, Zakrzewski, faced with overwhelming evidence and his own confession, chose to plead guilty. In 1996, he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder. This guilty plea, while it spared the prosecution a long and costly trial, did not exempt him from the maximum penalty. On April 19, 1996, Okaloosa County Circuit Court Judge G. Robert Barron sentenced Edward J. Zakrzewski II to death for the 3 murders. The brutality of the crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, especially the children, and the demonstrated premeditation in attacking his wife and subsequently fleeing undoubtedly influenced the court's decision. The death sentence in cases of familicide is a complex issue. A hypothetical lawyer might explain that although a guilty plea can sometimes result in a lighter sentence, in cases of extreme violence and multiple victims, especially minors, the death penalty is a likely legal consequence in states like Florida that enforce it rigorously. After his sentencing, Edward Zakrzewski was transferred to death row at Florida State Prison in Stark. There, he would spend decades, exhausting all state and federal avenues of appeal. Life on death row is an existence in limbo, marked by strict security protocols, the constant wait for legal resolution, and the imminent specter of execution. Each appeal, each motion, represents an attempt to delay the inevitable, a fight for life that drags on for years, even decades. Court records show that his appeals were denied, the most recent by the Florida Supreme Court in September 2018, confirming his final fate. The silence of the cell was an echo of the wait, a countdown to the end. On July 1, 2025, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, signed the death warrant for Edward J. Zakrzewski II. This signature marked the beginning of the final countdown for Zakrzewski, scheduling his execution for July 31, 2025. This act is not just an administrative formality. It is a moment of profound solemnity and a reminder of the power of state justice. The signing of this death warrant also has broader meaning for the state of Florida. If not stopped by the courts, Zakrzewski's execution would be the 9th ordered by Governor DeSantis in 2025, a number that sets a modern record for executions approved by a Florida governor in a single year. This underscores the state's firm stance on enforcing the death penalty for the most atrocious crimes. For those living on death row, the signing of a death warrant is the moment when legal abstraction becomes an imminent reality. The silence of the cell becomes an echo of waiting, a countdown to the end. It is in this period that the last legal appeals are exhausted, the families of the victims and the condemned prepare for closure or loss, and society reflects on justice and punishment. An ethical legal analysis might point out that the death penalty, in cases like Zakrzewski's, raises questions about retribution, deterrence, and the value of human life. While for the families of the victims it may represent closure and justice for their brutal loss, for others, the execution remains a subject of intense moral and humanitarian debate. The discussion is not only about whether capital punishment is right or wrong, but about its impact on society, on victims, and on the justice system itself. On July 31, 2025, Florida State Prison in Stark will become the center of attention. The time, 6 p.m., will mark the moment when Edward J. Zakrzewski II will face the culmination of his acts. The execution process in Florida is methodical and solemn. The condemned is transferred to the execution chamber, where he is prepared for lethal injection. At this point in the narrative, many will wonder about the last moments. What was his last meal? What were his final words? It is important to note that, despite the intensity of this moment and public interest, the available sources have not detailed Edward J. Zakrzewski II's last meal nor his final words. These details, which often form part of the story of an execution, have not been publicly reported in the news to which we had access. However, it is essential to reflect on the magnitude of this final moment. For the families of Sylvia, Edward Jr., and Anna, this day represents the long-awaited end to a wait that stretched for decades, a legal closure to the nightmare that began in 1994. For them, Zakrzewski's execution may be perceived as the final act of justice for their loved ones, a painful but necessary culmination. For the prison officers, it is a grim and professional duty carried out with the utmost seriousness, a reminder of the gravity of their work. A criminologist or psychologist could speculate at length about the mentality of a condemned person in their final hours. It is a complex and often inscrutable psychological terrain. Some inmates show genuine remorse, a late awareness of the atrocity of their acts. Others, in an act of self-deception or persistent conviction, maintain their innocence until the end, defying all evidence. And some simply face their fate with cold resignation, accepting the inevitable without showing apparent emotion. Human nature is intricately complex until the last breath, and in a moment as definitive as execution, the social masks people wear often fall, revealing the true essence of their being. The execution of Edward J. Zakrzewski II is not just an event. It closes a painful and dark chapter in Florida's criminal history, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions about justice, morality, and the nature of evil. The case of Edward J. Zakrzewski II is a multifaceted tragedy that resonates deeply in the collective consciousness. It is the heartbreaking story of a family destroyed by rage, a clear manifestation of the brutality that can emerge from an unaddressed domestic crisis. It is also a testament to the long and arduous road that justice must travel, step by step, to respond to acts of such extreme violence, seeking some form of balance amid chaos. The names Sylvia, Edward Jr., and Anna Zakrzewski are not just names in a file. They will remain as a somber reminder of the inherent vulnerability of life and the devastating impact that uncontrolled anger can have when it is allowed to consume an individual. Zakrzewski's story also underscores the crucial importance of programs like Unsolved Mysteries. These programs do not merely entertain, they play a vital role in solving crimes, keeping the hopes of victims and their families alive. They have the unique capacity to mobilize public opinion, exerting significant pressure that can often lead even the most elusive fugitives to finally face justice. It shows, undeniably, that even after years or decades, the relentless pursuit of truth and accountability can, and often does, prevail. This case serves as a powerful reminder that memory and determination can ultimately unmask evil and bring it to light. In approaching this case, we have sought not only to recount the facts, but to explore the emotional and psychological depths of a crime that defies comprehension. The execution of Edward J. Zakrzewski II on July 31st is not a celebration, but a somber epilogue to a story of family violence that shocked a nation. It is the moment when the legal system, in its most terminal form, brings a chapter to an end, hoping that somehow the victims and their loved ones find a measure of peace and closure. The legacy of this case forces us to reflect on domestic violence, on warning signs, and on the need for support systems for those trapped in dangerous relationships. It also reminds us that justice, though sometimes slow, tirelessly seeks balance for those who have suffered the unimaginable. A man who killed his family dies without saying goodbye. The story of Zakrzewski, marked by incomprehensible violence, concludes not with a final statement, not with a last-minute repentance, but in absolute silence. For us, the witnesses to this tragedy, what remains is the most powerful word, a question that resonates with overwhelming force. Is this worth it? This final question compels us to confront the very essence of capital punishment. Is this silence, this absence of farewell, a just closure for the magnitude of his crimes? Does it represent the culmination of pain and justice for the victims, or simply a final act of dehumanization, an echo of the barbarity he himself perpetrated? In the context of the 21st century, where our understanding of justice, rehabilitation, and punishment has evolved, the question persists. Is the final silence the answer we seek? If you are interested in learning about more well-researched criminal cases, don't forget to subscribe. Also, we invite you to leave a comment with your opinion. Are you for or against capital punishment?